the Adam and Eve story, as it's written in the Bible, is not about the origin of sin. It might be about the origin of death, right? But it's not. It doesn't explain where sin comes from. In the Second Temple period, besides Christian texts, we don't really see this idea prominently at all in the text that we have, except for a little hint in the Second Temple period. This idea that sin and death have the same origin is not something we see.
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm on with Dr. Miryam Brand. We're going to be talking about the origin of sin, death, and evil according to the earliest Jews. How are you doing today, Dr. Brand?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Okay, can you give us just your general background, your education, what you're doing now, like any scholarly works you've done?
Oh, so my PhD is from New York University. I studied with Lawrence Schiffman, who's an expert in Dead Sea Scrolls. I also studied with Mark Smith, who's very well known in Bible and Dead Sea Scrolls. My dissertation was on the source of sin in Second Temple literature. Did they see it as coming from a demon, evil inclination? How did that interact with ideas of free will and determination? So that was my dissertation, which I believe is freely available. And then my book, which is a little expensive. So my book is called Evil Within and Without, The Source of Sin and Its Nature in Second Temple Literature. And since then, I've written some articles also about the role of Belial, some things about Persian influence on ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Second Temple period. Recently, I've been working, even though nothing's published yet, I've been working a little bit on kind of the end of prophecy, how the idea of prophecy became kind of suspect while there were still kind of prophets wandering around. That's like an early Second Temple period. So that's something I'm working on.
Awesome. Yeah. I would strongly recommend everyone check out your podcast, your YouTube. I have been binge watching this, not even preparation for this, just because like you have such great content out there. So it is great to see, and I'll put all that links in the description so they can check that out.
Okay,
So
great.
we're going to be talking about, the origin of sin, death, and evil, and according to earliest Jews. So, most people have heard about, like, Adam and Eve narrative and, what the New Testament says about that. Can you talk about, texts outside of those that talk about the origin of sin, death,
Right.
and evil?
So what's interesting is, and I believe I have an episode on this in my podcast for anyone who wants to hear it. The Adam and Eve story, as it's written in the Bible, is not about the origin of sin. It might be about the origin of death, right? But it's not. It doesn't explain where sin comes from. Adam gets a commandment that he disobeys, right? And there's no explanation of how he was able to disobey it. There's nothing that says and now everyone will sin. Nothing like that. The consequences are essentially you are going to be suffer the way humans suffer, right? So you're going to have to grow your food. You can't just eat it like animals do. It doesn't say like animals do, but that's kind of the subtext. Is that there's certain things that animals can just kind of graze or eat fruit. You're going to have to live by the sweat of your brow, right? And Eve is going to give birth in pain, right? As opposed to at least most animals that can just give birth. And that's I think that there are some animals that have more of a problem, but I've heard that that for humans that is very much a result of having large heads that have and being walking upright. So you've got a small pelvis and a large head that has to go through it, and that's one of the issues. But there are other issues with human childbirth that make it not automatic, that make it kind of difficult. And all these different things are the consequences of that sin, and then of course they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden. But there's nothing there that actually says, oh, and now everyone's going to sin. There's more of a statement about sin when we talk about Cain and Abel, because Cain actually gets an oracle from God telling him this is what sin is like. Sin wants you, but because sin wants you, you can control it. Now there is a parallel when God talks about sin to Cain. There's absolutely a parallel between that and the verbal structure is identical to the way God talks about sin in that oracle, to the way God talks about Eve's desire for Adam, that's a punishment in the Adam and Eve story. So it wouldn't be that big a stretch for someone to say, oh, I mean, it would be a little bit of a stretch, but you could say, oh, God said about Eve that her desire is to her husband and he will rule over her. And God's saying to Cain that sin's desire is to him and he will rule over sin. Maybe that's their parallel, woman and sin, right? Now, but that is and that's probably where this, I mean, that and the combination of the actual story where after all, Eve gives Adam the fruit, right? So that, and in fact, what we see in Second Temple literature is that this story is generally not considered a story about the origin of sin. The only thing when we have, and then when I say Second Temple, I say, wow, the Second Temple standing, because as soon as we have the books of Fourth Ezra and Second Baruch, that are very shortly after the destruction, right, in 70 CE, they're probably from around 100 CE. So they assume that everyone has this idea of sin coming from Adam, right? I think it's Second Baruch that says, yeah, it's Second Baruch that says, don't blame your sins on Adam. Everyone is the Adam of his own soul, which I love. I think that's a great quote. Like, you're your own Adam. Don't blame your sins on Adam, right? There's this idea, well, I'm sinning because Adam sinned and I've somehow, and it's his fault. And Second Baruch is saying, no, you're your own Adam. You're responsible. But he's arguing against clearly an idea that's had major traction, right? So you have a similar thing in Fourth Ezra where where Ezra, the character Ezra in Fourth Ezra, argues that because of Adam we have this evil heart. And it's not clear, he's not consistent whether it's because Adam was created with it or whether it's because Adam sinned and then he got it. Like, did he sin because of the evil heart? Did he get the evil heart because of the sin? He's not really it's not really consistent in Fourth Ezra, but there is this idea. And so, and both of those works, I mean, they have a lot of parallels. Fourth Ezra and Second Baruch, really, a lot of times people read them together because there's so many parallels there. But it's interesting that both of them have this assumption that we all know this idea, right? And this is a very central idea. When in the Second Temple period, besides Christian texts, we don't really see this idea prominently at all in the text that we have. Excuse me, except for a little hint, right, in Ben Sirach, in Sirach, and that's Sirach 25:24, where he says, from woman is the beginning of sin and of death. And he's, by the way, the context there in Ben Sirach is that he's talking about how bad a bad woman or a bad wife is, right? He's talking in the context of women can be like, he's not the most pro woman guy, right? But he's talking about specifically about bad women, right? And in that context he says, and from a woman is the beginning of sin and of death. And it's very clear that that's kind of a reference to this idea, right? That sin comes from the Adam and Eve, what Eve did. Now, the other ideas in the Second Temple period of where sin is coming from, a really prominent idea was based on what we call the Watcher's story or the Watcher's myth, and that is based on Genesis 6:1-4. So in Genesis 6:1-4, you have the sons of God and the daughters of man, right? Bnei Elohim ufnot Adam. So the sons of God, they're clearly some kind of divine beings, they're some kind of angels, and they mate with human women. And it says, and that's when there were the Rephaim. And so afterwards it's read as their children were the Rephaim. Rephaim are referred to later in Numbers as giants, right? So in the Second Temple period, there was a lot of what's called rewritten Bible, rewriting biblical stories and kind of building on biblical stories as well. So rewriting biblical stories also, like to fix theological problems that people saw in the stories, stuff like that, but also like just expanding on these stories. So one of the ways they did that was taking that story where you have angels mating with human women, having offspring that seem to possibly be giants. They're like, okay, so these offspring are giants. This story happens right before the flood, and they're like, okay, let's connect. That's connected clearly, right? So this is all kind of interpretation. We see this in Enoch and later on in Jubilees. So in the book of First Enoch, we have something called the Book of the Watchers, which really spells out this story. It itself is probably combining three different threads of this story, like three different versions, where this is the sin, where there's the sin of mating with human women. In Enoch, there's the sin of mating with human women. There's the sin of teaching forbidden knowledge, which is more it's you teach women about makeup. This is in Enoch, right? They teach women about like makeup, which of course leads to like lust. They teach men how to make weapons, which leads to war, and this of course leads to bad stuff. And that's another one. That's Asael does that, and then yeah, because there are different people in First Enoch. So Shemichaza is the guy who's like, hey, let's all mate with human women so that we can have kids. That's like the big. He really wants to have children. And Asael wants to teach humans things. And then there's another thread, which is that they're teaching humans magic, which is forbidden. And so that's an Enoch. But at any rate, the idea is, and now I'm going to pretty much be basing on the Enoch version of Enoch and Jubilees versions of the story, where you have so the giants. So God's like Enoch, God's like, you guys are angels, you have immortality, you don't get kids. And now their punishment, the angels themselves are kind of bound and put in like in a kind of a fiery holding den, waiting for the end time. And the giants are essentially they're given swords and they kill each other because they're already so violent. And they've caused all this violence that causes the flood, right? There's this kind of catching this violence, and it causes the humans to sin, and then and what happens is in the Jubilee story, you have so the giants are killed, but the problem is that they're part angel, right? They're part angel, part human. The angel part can't really be killed. They're spirits, and they're tied to earth because they came from people. And so these are kind of evil spirits that are going to stick around. And in Jubilees, you have this Mastema character who's like the Satan character of Jubilees, and he's like, "Listen, I need help to do all my work. So could I have like a tenth of them?" Because God's answering, the plea to like Don's plea to get rid of 9/10. And he's like, okay, get rid of them. So he's like, okay, you know what? I'll leave it 10th, and they're going to be under Mastema. So whatever, either way, Enoch or Jubilees, you've got these evil spirits kind of wandering around, causing problems. So either in Enoch they're more chaotic, in Jubilees they report to someone, in theory at least. We see in the Dead Sea Scrolls that there are prayers where it's talking about God, your laws are in me, and they're struggling with the bastard spirits inside me. And the bastard spirits are these we know that they're called bastards because in Judaism, a bastard is not someone who's born out of wedlock. In Judaism, a bastard is someone who's born out of an illicit union, a union that's not allowed. Right. So in other words, if a woman is married to a man and then she has an affair and has a child, that child is considered a bastard, a mamzer. In this case, the illicit union is angels with human women. So angels with human women, that's illicit union. Their spirit children are spirit bastards, and so they're called kind of these spirit bastards and or bastard spirits, I should say, bastard spirits. And so there are these prayers in it from Qumran that are like, they're in me. They're fighting with your laws that are kind of, in other words, I want to do right. I want to be righteous, but there's a struggle, right? And so there's this idea that these evil spirits can cause people to sin. And it's answering this question that they have very much that really comes up in the Second Temple period and doesn't seem to come up as much in the previous period, in the more biblical period. That if God doesn't want me to sin, if God doesn't want me to sin and God created me, why do I want to sin? Like that doesn't make any sense. Why do I want to sin? And when I was teaching undergraduates, they would be like, well, because sinning is fun. I'm like, yes, but why is sinning fun? Sinning should not be fun if God created me and doesn't want me to sin, right? Why is sinning fun? So the answer in this case is, well, there are these evil spirits and they're making me want to sin. Another explanation for where sin is coming from is more closer to the kind of the idea of an evil inclination, and that's kind of an inborn evil inclination. You have that very much. Ben Sira really spells it out in chapter 15. If you want to look, and this idea that God gave you an inclination, it can be evil, but you need to know that and resist it. Like, it's your choice and your responsibility. Now, either way, your responsibility isn't removed. Even if they're demonic spirits, you can still say, no, I'm standing up to it, right? So in general, um, there's there is, like, so for example, at Qumran there was a lot of determinism. The Qumran, the Dead Sea sect, had a lot of determinism, but even they, when they are introducing new members or reminding the members like about the rules, they emphasize responsibility. They're like, you have to choose God's commandments and not your own will. Like, there's an assumption you've got an evil inclination, fine. You've got to choose God's commandments and not your own will. And they'll use the word choice several times, like in the Damascus document, uses actually the root bachar, choice, several times. So you have those are kind of central ideas, and they're not, the evil inclination is not always called the evil inclination. Later on in Judaism, you have this idea of a yetzer hara, the evil inclination becomes almost demonic in the way that Talmud talks about it, talks about him, right? Like, it almost talks about, it kind of combines this idea of kind of a Satan and an evil inclination, and kind of combined in one thing, because we don't have the same idea of the Satan who opposes God, because that would be ridiculous in Jewish, at least in Jewish, thought, the idea that a creature could dare to oppose God. On the contrary, the Satan in Judaism has a function in the divine court, right? His job is to prosecute people for sinning, right? So, like, we're like, don't listen, in the days of awe, so we say, God, don't listen to the Satan, don't listen to the prosecutor, listen to our prayers, right? Because, like, it's the idea is that's kind of Satan's job, is to, like, bring us, like, he can also tempt us, right? But his job is kind of bring us to justice. There's also less of an idea of hell in Judaism. It's not that it's never mentioned, it is, but it's much more of an idea of that it's much more of a purgatory, in that you purge your sin. In other words, you go through something that kind of cleanses you of sin. It's punishment, it's not pleasant, but then you go and you'll get your place in heaven, right? And so there's no idea of you're in hell forever. Unless you lose your place in heaven, and that's like a thing. Like, what makes you lose? What horrible sin would make you lose your place in heaven? And there are arguments about that. But at any rate, that's much later. That's all Talmudic. So if we talk about Second Temple, so it's really, they do have this idea of these bastard spirits. They have this idea of an inborn evil inclination, or simply your will. Like, that humans have these wills to evil, right? And they'll say and they'll use biblical language. You went b'shrivut libcha. You went in the stubbornness of your heart, right? The stubbornness of your heart. So, like, this idea that humans have this kind of natural inclination toward evil. I mean, even if we go outside of Israel, Philo, who's in Alexandria, he absolutely has this idea that sometimes he thinks it's equal, but a lot of times he seems to think that people have an inclination towards doing bad. Like, and that's kind of a natural thing about people. Yeah, so that's really how it goes. And then clearly this Adam and Eve explanation is somewhere in the background, because we have Ben Sira's kind of off the cuff reference to it, and also after the destruction, it seems to be so prominent. Just from the evidence of Fourth Ezra and Second Baruch, it really seems to be a prominent idea. And of course, Paul's a Jew living during the Second Temple period, and he absolutely points to this idea. So it's interesting that we don't see it more prominently. And the question is, why does it become prominent apparently after the destruction? I think maybe because the destruction seems like such a cataclysmic punishment, there needs to be a cataclysmic sin that can explain it. And I think that may be why. It's and also a feeling of it also seems to contribute, at least in Fourth Ezra, to a feeling of helplessness. Right here, we have this evil heart from Adam. What can we do? Because we're going to be punished for sinning, but what are we supposed to do against this thing that we inherited? And I think that's the line in Second Baruch where he's like, "You're your own Adam." That, like, no, don't be defeated that way. And I think maybe also that feeling of defeat after the destruction also kind of influence the acceptance of that idea.
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now?
Wow, that is a lot of different stuff there. Really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about a lot of sin and evil, but like what specifically about, is there anything about where they mention like death, like the origin of death in there, like where that came from?
Right. So it's not. It doesn't seem to be a super prominent problem in the Second Temple period. So like the connection between sin and death. I mean, we do see it in that again when Ben Sira in that off the cuff, not particularly in depth statement by Ben Sira that from a woman is the beginning of sin and death, right? And that's clearly taken from it's connecting it to the story of Adam and Eve. But what we see in general in the Second Temple period, this idea that sin and death have the same origin is not something we see in the Bible. There's this idea that sins lead to death, right? So that when when we're talking about the attributes of God, God is patient, he's merciful, and he stretches out punishment over 3 to 4 generations. Why is that important? Because if the whole generation sins, then they're going to be wiped out. But no, God's patient. He stretches out. He stretches out the punishment. So and that's also part of the idea, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, before we get to the Second Temple period, that you can't just wipe out sin, right? Sin is damage that you've done that's got to be fixed. And so you've got to fix it. The punishment has to happen. So if we want to if we want to avoid killing everyone, so we're going to try and stretch it out. And then what happens is the idea that sin can't be just wiped out kind of goes like, again, we have atonement in the Bible. That's more of a kind of a cleansing, right? But it's not a total like, oh, we're just wiping it out, there are no consequences. Then when we get to the end of the First Temple period, we have Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and they're both it's very interesting because they both quote the same saying, right? Which is the fathers ate unripe grapes and the son's teeth dulled, which is it's clear from context that what's going on. And they're saying, everyone's saying this now. You're saying this. What does that mean, you're saying this? It means that Jews of that generation are saying the reason that we're being punished is because our forefathers sinned. And now they sinned and we're being punished. They ate the unripe grapes, our teeth are dulled. And while Jeremiah says that won't be true kind of in the Messianic age. In the future, you won't be able to say that anymore. And Ezekiel's like, you can't say that now. And he has a long kind of creed about it. You're talking about how, first of all, there's from Ezekiel's point of view, there's no such thing as collective punishment either, where you can't save someone else by being righteous, and no one's suffering for you because you're wicked. You suffer for your own sins, and you also don't suffer for your father, and you can't your sins aren't passed down to your son, and you also can't save a righteous son isn't going to save his wicked father, and you at any moment must be righteous, because if you were righteous and become wicked, well, now you're going to die. And that's the thing, is that in Ezekiel, if you look at Ezekiel, I think it's chapters 18 and 33 where he really goes into this. His idea is, you sin, you die, right? Like, that's the punishment for sin, is death. And then it actually becomes a problem understanding how he thought this was going to work, because he says, well, if you're a righteous person and then you become wicked, you will die. If you're a wicked person and you become righteous, you've saved yourself. Well, at what point then? What's the point? What's the cutoff point where you're going to be judged and you either die or you don't? Because if you can repent at any time, then you can't. How can you kill me yesterday? Like, that doesn't work. But he doesn't seem to be disturbed by that. That doesn't seem to be a problem for him. And he does talk a lot when he's talking about becoming righteous, a wicked person who becomes righteous and then he'll live, everything will be fine. He does talk about him correcting the evil he's done. Like, he stole and he returns the money, right? It's a question of what he would say if someone murdered someone. Like, can you repent from that? Like, it would seem like not. Like, so But that's kind of the connection between sin and death in the Hebrew Bible, is that if you sin, the punishment should be death. Not on the human. Not talking about the human level. I'm not talking about that other people should stone you. I'm talking about the level of God punishes you for sinning. That punishment is death. The human punishments are much clearer in terms of different levels of punishment. But when we get to the Second Temple period, it's already what Ezekiel has kind of set out in terms of this idea that you can repent and kind of wipe everything away. That's already pretty clear to people. Like, you can repent and everything is fine. You can return to the right path and you'll be okay. So that connection between sin and death, and also there's this rising belief in resurrection, right? So it's not so clear, and that's resurrection at the end time, right? So we don't have this idea, and this is another thing that sometimes people are surprised to discover. So in the Hebrew Bible, there isn't much of an afterlife at all, right? There's a place called Sheol, right? Which is kind of like or Shachat sometimes. It's like the pit, right? So you kind of sit there, sit there in the mud. Like, there's not much going on there. It's not a place you really want to go, and that's the end of the road, right? So there isn't an idea that this is all going to be evened out in the afterlife. And this is an idea that now is common in both Judaism and Christianity, where, well, once people die, they'll be rewarded or punished according to what they did, right? So while the idea of hell as an infinite place to end up doesn't really exist in Judaism, but there is an idea of hell where you get punished for what you did, right? And then you can go on to heaven. And certainly in Christianity, hell is very prominent. In the Hebrew Bible, we don't really have either. We just kind of have this death place where you just kind of hang out, right? Is you go down to it, right? You go down to it, and then that's it. And then the question is, what happens is, and then when we get into the Second Temple period, there's still, most works still don't have a super fleshed out afterlife. What you have is a place where the souls go and kind of wait. They're waiting for the end time. In the end time, everything's going to get evened out, right? So in the end time, the wicked are going to get punished and destroyed, and the righteous are going to get rewarded. And meanwhile, they just kind of hang around there waiting, right? And the angels actually can, evil angels, the angels who like transgress, they can get punished like in fiery pits, whatever. But people are less. The souls are just kind of hanging around, especially righteous souls. They're just kind of hanging around there, waiting for the end time, and that's the idea of resurrection, is that you resurrected and then you get your reward. There is one section of Enoch which has, first Enoch is really a collection of different works about Enoch, all written during different time periods. There's a later work of Enoch that's included in first Enoch, where there's an interesting end time where the entire world really is destroyed, and everyone's just like in heaven. The righteous are in heaven, and then that's it. But for the most part, there's no super set out heaven and hell that's going to even things out. So then the question is, so when does stuff get evened out? How can things get evened out? So that's what the end time is for. The end time is to even everything out. It's like, because I can see this bothered people from biblical times, from the Hebrew Bible all the way through, is that like, I can see that righteous person there and their life is horrible, and I can see that wicked person there and they have a great life. Like, you can't tell me that guy isn't having fun. And then they die, and like, where's the justice? Where does it even out? So that in the Hebrew Bible, a lot of that you can say, well, he's suffering because his father was terrible, or that wicked person is really benefiting because his father was terrific, or things like that. You can say things like that, or that guy's wicked, but his son's going to really suffer because of that. You could say stuff like that, especially like and you have even in the Second Temple, in the beginning of the Second Temple period, if you look at Chronicles, it'll talk about kings like that. Like, why does Josiah die? He's such a great king, right? So there are two reasons. One is that he goes up against a pharaoh who he really shouldn't have gone up against, and it's very clear about that. Like, that was stupid. And also, his father Menashe sinned, and so he's suffering because of that. And it gives both accounts. It's what's called dual causality in the Bible, right? Where you have like, well, this is the real reason he died, which the natural reason he died, which is that he went up against a pharaoh he shouldn't have, and the kind of metaphysical reason he died was because his father sinned. So you have that idea, even to explain things. But once that becomes kind of an unacceptable explanation or a less acceptable explanation, then you start pointing at other things they're going to happen in the future. So in the Second Temple period, it's much more end time rather than like heaven and hell. So it'll be at the end time. That's when the wicked get destroyed and the righteous get rewarded. And meanwhile, everyone's just kind of waiting. So that actually kind of removes that death connection because you're just waiting. You're not really, you're dying, but then you're waiting for the end time, right? For things to get evened out. It's interesting because Josephus talks about the Essenes, and he talks about how courageous they were in battle and courageous under torture, because they knew they would get their souls back again. Right, because they knew they would be resurrected. We see a similar idea in Second Maccabees. In Second Maccabees, you have the martyrs who are resisting the sons, right, the 10 sons who say no, we won't bow down to the idol. Blah, 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 blah. And you have a version of it in the Talmud also, but they're like each one gives like this. Some of them have like little longer speeches, and they frequently mention resurrection. They're like, I will come back to life, and you wicked king, you will not come back to life. Like I'm willing to die. I'm gonna come back to life. So there's this rising belief in resurrection, and that really kind of ends up, and then there's no, I think that just makes in general less of a question about death. Like death is less of a problem. They spend much more time writing about things that are theological problems. Sin is a theological problem. Why do I want to sin? It's less of a theological problem. Why does that wicked person want to sin? Then they can say, oh, he belongs to Belial. He's a follower of Belial, because I don't have a problem explaining why he sinned, because he's wicked, right? But me, why do I want to sin? Right. And so that's one of their problems. And of course, the other problem is, why are wicked people doing well and why are righteous people suffering? And then they usually solve that with kind of this end time idea. It's like, this is a time, or like the Qumran community said, we're living in the time of the dominion of Belial. Belial, who was kind of their Satan. Belial has dominion in this period, and that kind of explains why no one's following the correct law that we're teaching them. Like it should be obvious what the real law is. I mean, that's our law, and we're explaining to people why this is much more logical, and no one's buying it, and that's Belial's influence, and also that's why we're suffering, even though we're the good guys, and that's going to come to an end, right? And that's like what things like the War School are about. So there's not that much. No one's. It doesn't seem to be it's not. No one's worried too much about the origin of death. It seems like no one's. It's not a theological problem. Everyone's like, okay, we're going to die, but then there is an argument about resurrection. It is happening kind of behind the curtain. We're not witness to the argument so much. There's a little bit of a polemic about it in Second Maccabees, but they're not really connecting the origin of sin and the origin of death as in terms of origin.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, huh?
Yeah.
So it seems like they really.
Right. Well, the exception thing, of course, like the Ben Sira thing with Adam and Eve. Once you talk about the Adam and Eve story, then it's very easy to make that connection, I guess. But again, it's not a popular story at the time.
Huh, interesting. So you've talked in the past about we don't really have a full picture in regards to we don't have every single text ever written. We don't have we can't talk to the people. So can you talk about in your opinion, how much of the text of the time period do we actually have? Are they just one really small group of people, and maybe other people outside of that could have had different views, or what do you think about all that?
Oh, for sure. And we know, just because when we have a little piece of something, we see that there's a whole, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if we look at, let's say, the Qumran community, right? And I'm of the opinion that they're not one-to-one the Essenes, right? I mean, I'm following also my advisor Larry Schiffman, who always said that they were kind of Sadducee or Stoici rather. There's come a lot of research has been done, which seems to point to the fact that at the very least they're not exactly the Essenes. They may be in some way connected to the Essenes, but they're not one-to-one the Essenes. But the Qumran community, they have this collection of texts, right? And they have there are, in cave 4, they found fragments of hundreds and hundreds of different scrolls that we only have little pieces of. Like sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. Sometimes it's like this teeny piece, but we can tell that it was from a different scroll, and we know what was written there. And here, this is this one small community. They're this one small, really strange community we never would have known existed, right? Until we discovered the scrolls, and we happened to discover them because they lived in the desert, and so the scrolls stuck around. And not just that, but like the ones that we have in their most complete form, they actually very carefully preserved, right? They put them, and they wrapped them up, and they put them in jars, and probably, as a maybe for for posterity. Like they were putting it in caves 1 and 1 is like not super near where the settlement is, whereas cave 4 is right next to them. So cave 4 may have been like a working library, and cave 1, what they put in cave 1 was more of we're saving this, right? And there you see this wide range of texts, some of them clearly from the community, and some of them seem to not be from the community. Some of them seem to be from other Jews, right? And some of the things seem to be like in general, and I know that loosely kind of Verman wants to say that Jubilees was written by the Qumran community. I find that very hard to, it's not. It's got a wide, it doesn't use Qumran terms. It doesn't have a theology that's simply one-to-one Qumran. The Qumran community, it's a wider document. So Jubilees was written outside the group. Enoch, all the books of Enoch, which are different, also show different interests outside the community. We also have obviously Enoch was preserved by the Ethiopic church, right? The Ethiopian church. So that's how we have Enoch. We have all the Jubilees also because it kept by the Ethiopian church. Now, how to get to the Ethiopian church, which is I believe the earliest church, because there were Jews who were reading these and were keeping them, right? So Jews outside of the Qumran community and Jews that were unusual. These books were unusual enough that they were not accepted by the Alexandrian Jewish community either. We have texts. So let's talk about the canon for a bit. Okay, so the Judean canon, the Hebrew Bible, in its entirety. What seems to be kind of the principle for that is these books were considered holy, and they were considered to be written during the period when prophecy existed. Okay, so the unifying idea of the Judean canon, the Hebrew Bible, seems to be that these books are considered holy, right? And they are they're considered holy, and they're written and they're composed while prophecy still is considered to exist. So that's Return to Zion. So up through the Return to Zion, right? So that's Chronicles is in there, Ezra and Nehemiah are in there, Haggai, Zechariah, that's Zechariah, and Malachi, that's Malachi. Those are in there. Those are the last prophets, right? And then you have books like Daniel, books like Esther, which place themselves in the Persian period. So that places themselves when there's still prophecy, right? According to Jewish tradition, prophecy lasts through the Return to Zion or into the Return to Zion. So all these books are composed during that period, and they're also considered holy. So Ben Sira doesn't make it in. Right, Ben Sira doesn't make it in, not because they don't consider him important, but because he very clearly writes later. Everyone knows that he's writing in the Ptolemaic period. His grandson is the guy who translates his book into Greek for the Septuagint, right? But the Alexandrian Jewish community keeps many more books because they keep anything that they think is valuable and has a good message, right? So they've got First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, which are clearly worship about the Maccabees, are clearly later. They've got Tobit, which is a really fun read, and you should have the interest, the importance of kind of marrying your cousins and prayer and burying your dead, right? Like different things and it's a good read. It's a fun read, Tobit. So there are books that the Alexandrian Jewish community is keeping from different and they, some of them are written with different, like Tobit was probably written originally in Aramaic. First Maccabees originally in Hebrew, Second Maccabees in Greek. So they're collecting all these different books coming from all sorts of different Jewish groups or Jews. And then you get to Qumran, and they've got works that weren't kept by any church, that weren't kept by the Alexandrian Jewish community, and yet weren't just Qumran. Like we have the Genesis Apocryphon, which is written in Aramaic and it clearly doesn't come from the community. So, and this is this book that's expanding on the stories in Genesis, right? So it's about Noah. Has a poem about Sarah's beauty, because when they go to the Pharaoh and say, because it says in the Bible, it says that the Pharaoh's advisors told him about her tremendous beauty, right? So there's a little poem about the beauty, right? In Genesis Apocryphon, there's a poem about her beauty. They go into, it's a little bit not quite racy, but a little racier than you'd want it to get about Sarah, and then it ends with, an even greater than her beauty is her wisdom. So it's a great quote. If you ever see any guy who's married who writes a thesis on Second Temple literature has that quote. So you will find that quote all over the place in dedications, in dissertations, because it's and even greater than her beauty is her wisdom, and they dedicate it to their wives. It's a perfect quote. But you have all these works from all these different places that we wouldn't know about if we didn't happen to have this kind of group of very strange Jews in the desert that managed to keep that managed to preserve their scrolls. So who knows? And it's clearly that there are different groups, right? And we also know from the Gospels, right, that talk about, we have John the Baptist, and we don't know a lot about John the Baptist group. We know it's important enough that in Mark, that's Jesus's first claim to fame, right? That he's baptized by John the Baptist. Like, that's like, hey, look, he's got a seal of approval kind of thing. So here's, there are all these different groups in Judaism going on in that time. Probably freer. And it's interesting that even in Judea, where it does seem like at least there's at least a concern in the temple about this group of Jews at Qumran, because they send according to the scrolls, right? At some point, a priest comes to Qumran to make them eat on their Yom Kippur, right? Because they're keeping a different calendar. So someone's coming from Jerusalem to Qumran to say, this is not Yom Kippur, guys. Don't fast. It's not Yom Kippur. And they don't listen, right? So there is clearly an attempt, at least, to keep people, somewhat unified in Judea, but probably in the Galilee, there was a lot more freedom in general, also in terms of these different groups. So, or at least there's a strong possibility. So, yeah, I mean, who knows? It's very hard to know, because there are so many of these works we never would have known existed, honestly, if we didn't just happen to find them, right? There's no reference to them. There are certain things like the Damascus document. This is always the question. The Damascus document was found in the Cairo Geniza as well, right? In 2 copies. And the question is, okay, so who in the world is still copying the Damascus document? And one of the theories is that there is a story about that some scrolls were discovered actually under, I think, the Armenian patriarch called Jews to say, hey, we found some of your scrolls, maybe you want to collect them. And then it would make sense that they would say, oh, well, these are Hebrew scrolls, they are important, we should copy them, right? They're clearly meant to be learned, right? So that's a possibility, that they found them again, and so they copied them. But yeah, so it's when we see so many documents that simply were lost, or even things that weren't lost, that in Jewish tradition it's just stopped referring to, that it was kind of inaccessible. So it's really hard to know. It's hard to know how many different things there could have been, when to say that it was all preserved and all collected and all passed down is clearly not true. Long answer to a short question.
No, awesome. Really, really great stuff there. Okay, so I'm really curious. So, you kind of talked about, the Old Testament. You talked about, around the Second Temple period. You talked about the intertestamental period. You talked about at the kind of the fall of Herod's temple in around 70 AD. What after that until now? Is there any interesting views on the origin of sin, death, or evil that you feel like stands out? I mean, you said there was a consensus of basically Adam and Eve is the cause there. But is there anything else besides that, or is it just all the way across?
Jews generally didn't believe it. It came back to those books, Fourth Ezra and Second Baruch, weren't kept by Jews. Like they were written by Jews, but they were
Huh.
kept by they were kept by the church. They weren't kept by Jews. So um, um, this idea of Adam and Eve as the origin of sin really kind of comes back. It comes back in the Middle Ages. The Ramban Nachmanides, he talks about it. That's, I think, 1100 and something. So it's not, and in the Zohar, you have it in the Zohar. The Zohar is Kabbalah. So academically, the Zohar is like 12th century. So like in Jewish tradition, the Zohar is much earlier, right? The Zohar is like Second Temple, but in academic opinion, you're talking about like also early Middle Ages, right? So it kind of comes back probably from Christian influence. In other words, probably from meetings with Christians. Christians talk about it a lot. It's in the imagery and all the stuff. There's also an interesting. It's like I said in Hebrew tradition. So the Satan is he
Right.
fulfills a role in the court, right? Now there is in the Talmud, there's this idea of combining the evil inclination, Satan, and the angel of death all in one character. Like, oh, Satan is the evil inclination, right? So that kind of ties it all together. But there still isn't, and you could talk about, but like in Jewish tradition, the snake isn't Satan. Like this actually was a surprise to me when I first started teaching that story. And someone's like, but the snake is Satan. I'm like, no, the snake's a snake. It's a snake. It's a weird snake. It's it can talk. It's like, it's very smart, right? But it's a snake. And in Jewish tradition, it's a snake. Like that's what it is. It's a snake, right? And it gets punished as a snake. Snakes get punished. They now have to, just crawl around in their stomachs, right? Dirt, right? And the classic Jewish explanation of why is eating dirt a punishment? Because there's always dirt, right? And the answer is because you never have to look up to God for help, for sustenance. Like you never have to look up, right? You're just looking down. But this idea that sin comes from Adam and Eve, it kind of comes back into Jewish tradition in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages. It's not something that is a prominent explanation. And again, if you look at the text, it's not an explanation of sin. You could see it as an explanation of death, but not really of sin. And again, the symbolism of the snake is something that because in Christianity, the snake is Satan. That changes the whole meaning of the story, right? So once it's Satan, like wow, you can say like in Judaism, it's like, well, what was the snake's problem? Like what was going on, right? And also, how does it have this inside knowledge about what things do, or is he just pretending? So there are like you can ask questions about the snake, but in general, of course, I'm making generalizations about Judaism as a whole. But in general, no, this isn't an idea that continues in Judaism. Particularly, it more comes back in the Middle Ages.
Wow, that's extremely fascinating. I did not know that. Wow. Okay. So like, what about today? I grew up in very American, Christianity of, as you're talking about, like the Satan is the snake, and that's where sin came from. Maybe I don't know if you feel comfortable answering this question. Like, what do Jews believe today? Like,
So they're absolutely Jews will absolutely talk about that as a source of sin story. They
really? Okay.
absolutely will. I mean, if they still won't talk about the snake as Satan, like that's that's not a thing so much. But there is absolutely this idea. But in general, when you ask, if you ask a Jewish person where does sin come from, they'll say evil inclination, and it's up to you to choose. That's what they'll say. They generally won't say. If you say the standard explanation that I always grew up with what was the difference that sin is not so much that sin like this was the idea that the evil inclination came because the evil inclination came because Adam ate the fruit. So the evil inclination, why do we have an evil inclination? Because Adam ate the fruit, right? Adam and Eve ate the fruit. And that's something that if you ask, like, if you say, well, what if you ask some kid, what's the connection between the evil inclination and Adam and Eve? He'll say that's probably what he'll say. I remember there's a whole like thing. So what was the difference between the world before? So what was Adam's purpose? Because there's a big deal idea, and in the Hasidic, I went to a Hasidic school growing up. So in the Hasidic world, like you're supposed to fit. You're put on earth to like fix things in the world, right? So if Adam didn't have an evil inclination, what was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to like fight sin, kind of thing? And the answer is it would have been all outside him. In other words, there would be bad things that he would have to combat, but outside himself, he would not have to struggle within himself to not sin, right? It wouldn't be an internal struggle. It would be an external struggle. And because he ate the fruit, it's now an internal struggle that people have against their evil inclination. So I would say that's probably a mainstream idea in Judaism, that everyone has an evil inclination. It's up to them to resist it. But where does the evil inclination come from? It comes from Adam. Now, I wouldn't say that. Would everyone say that? I'm not sure. You could say, someone's like, well, God created me with an evil inclination. That's very much Ben Sira's kind of view. Like whenever I would say, when people say, what are you studying? Da, 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 and I would say, I would give them examples. And I would say, and Ben Sira says, and the answer they would always give me, I would say, I'm working on the source of sin. If I'm talking to like an Orthodox Jew, especially if it was a guy, the first thing he says is like, well, the answer is like, he's going to tell me the answer because like I don't know, but he's like, the answer it's because it's everyone has an evil inclination, but it's up to you to fight it, right? I'd be like, that's exactly Ben Sira. Like that's just classic Ben Sira. And then where does the evil inclination come from? They might say, well, God created people with it, or they might say, if usually if they're younger, right? It's usually more a kid thing to say that it came from Adam and Eve.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, look, you learn Genesis as in like your first grade. You start with Genesis, right? That's what you're reading. So you're working through like the creation text, Adam and Eve story when you're a little kid, when you're like in first grade. So that's when that really kind of is prominent, and you're like, that's and usually I remember it being like a thing like, if they hadn't eaten it, we wouldn't die. Like that's what I remember as being very prominent, like that. Like that kind of sucks. And then once you get to the point where you're learning exegetes, right, interpreters, then you're like, okay, so what? Then you start saying, okay, so what was But again, because they're interpreting the text, the Ramban Nachmanides absolutely brings in this idea that this is the origin of sin, right? But the others, Rashi doesn't. Rashi is like the standard. Rashi is the standard exegete you learn Torah, you learn the Pentateuch with. So he's he's much more like just kind of cueing to the text.
That's really fascinating. Okay, if you have some time left, I wanted to I can't remember, did you comment on the idea that sin might have came from Cain and Abel, or like they don't really talk about that much?
Oh no, so it's not that sin might have come from Cain and Abel, but here you have like what's interesting to me is like, again, I work in the Second Temple period text, so you would think like, okay, they're talking about sin a lot. Why wouldn't they talk about this oracle from God to Cain, talking about what sin is like? Why are they never quoting this? And they just aren't quoting it. And the only couple of references that I could find where it was, and the reference was kind of a similar structure, and to it is their desire, and the structure was unusual enough that it was a clear callback to the oracle about sin, that like sin is to you is its desire kind of thing. And I think the reason that they're not using that text so much, at least in like Qumran texts, etc., is because it's an oracle said to a sinner. Like Cain kills Abel, so what am I supposed to learn from this sinner this explanation of sin to a sinner, right? Like, because if he's a sinner, then if he's rather, they wouldn't say sinner, they would say wicked person is the way they put it. He's a wicked person. So sin to a wicked person, I can't learn anything about that. Well, sure, sin wants a wicked person. That's not news. Like, I can see those wicked people there. Sin clearly wants. So like, it doesn't help me, right? So, and that those were the references I'm talking about where they have a similar structure, and it's usually talking about demons and like the wicked kind of thing. Like, so it doesn't seem like, I think that they just didn't see it as something that spoke to them. It's something, and they don't really need an explanation of why the wicked sin, because, well, they're wicked. So, and it doesn't bug them so much. Like, oh yeah, the wicked sin could clearly belong to this Belial's minions, but it doesn't bother me because I'm not one of them. Like, I knew they were evil already, like, because they're bugging me. But so I think it's not a story about the origin of sin. It is kind of a story about those verses are not only about the origins, but they are about the nature of sin. Like, what is sin? Sin's crouching at the door and it wants you, but because it wants you, you can control it. That whole idea. And again, we have this we can see from the Adam and Eve story and from the Cain and Abel story, where we have that construction. There's this idea that the desired one has the power. Like, if sin wants you, then you can control it. And they're saying to Eve, you're going to want your husband, and so he can control you, right? So like, the wanted one is the controller in that case, which is interesting. But that's the idea. Well, sin wants you, but you're the one with the control, right? And that is an idea, absolutely, that of course continues through the Second Temple period, because anytime you're expecting people to keep rules and keep laws, you have to have this idea of responsibility. You can't say, well, it's all determined. Like the Qumran, where you have determinism is so strong at Qumran, and they absolutely will say, oh, okay, we were destined to be like the good guys. We were destined to be like the sons of light. But how do you know that this guy who joined last year was destined? Well, he joined, didn't he? So clearly he was destined. Like, that's kind of seems to be the way it works, right? And then when it comes down to it, and you have to accept the annual ceremony where you're accepting the covenant, it's like, hey, buddy, you know what? If you're a hypocrite and you're just saying that you're agreeing, but you don't really agree, and in your heart you're saying, I'm not really going to accept this, then guess what? You're in the lot of Belial now. You've just put yourself in the lot of Belial. So you have this responsibility. And again, in the Damascus time, it's like Damascus document. It's like, you need to choose. Your will. Your will is crummy. Your will is to do bad things. So you've got to choose God's commandment. Because you have this knowledge that you've got this evil, this will that's taking you to bad places, that just adds to your responsibility to do what God wants, because your will is, you can't go by your will. So you have to listen to God's commandments. So that responsibility, that idea of responsibility, really carries through, and that continues to carry through, of course, through Jewish thought in general. Is that regardless of any sort of influence, or if you say you have an evil inclination, and even if you make it describe it almost as demonic, that doesn't mean you don't have control. You have to take control, right? And it's interesting to connect that back to the verses spoken to that are addressed to Cain.
Yeah, for sure. That's really interesting. Got a little extra tidbits in there on just like how they saw sin, and that's really interesting. Okay, yeah, that's all I have for you, Dr. Brand. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or once again, can you point people to your resources and your podcast on YouTube?
Sure. So my podcast on YouTube, I haven't posted for a while, but it does a lot on the Second Temple period and my work in my book. So I recommend that. And also I have my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is a recording of classes that I continue to give. Every year I do a different topic. So the first series there is Bible and the ancient Near East, which is an interesting kind of look at different ancient Near Eastern texts. And I have a Facebook group that you can use to get those texts, like if you need them, like they're there. And it's linked from the YouTube videos. And let's see, did that. And I did topics in prophecy I did last year. And this year I'm doing the book of Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so awesome. That's really appreciated. Everyone should definitely go check that out. I'm a huge fan of your work. This is so awesome. Just all of this. This is great. So yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your day there, Dr. Brand.
Okay. You too. Have a good night. Sleep well.
Awesome.
Take
I
care.
appreciate it.
Bye.